next call will be with Dr. Amanda Brock. It will be about the state. Are Dr. Amanda ready? State of open and how open source is shaping the 20s, how open source is shaping up in the roaring 20s. Dr. Amanda is the CEO of OpenUK, and she will share with us. She is also the European representative of the Open Invention Network, and we will enjoy now a talk about open source, which is a very important area in the software also nowadays. Welcome, Dr. Amanda. Do you hear us? I see Dr. Amanda's camera is fixed, I think. Dr. Amanda's camera is fixed. Sorry. It seems that Dr. Amanda has connection problem, and we will try to fix. So.
Hello? I don't know whether anybody can hear me. Can somebody let me know?
Yeah. Dr. Amanda, we are still 10 minutes before your time, but we
Okay.
welcome you at this session. Dr. Amanda will speak about the state of open, how open source is shaping up in the roaring 20s. And Dr. Amanda is the CEO of the OpenUK, and she is responsible about the European Open Invention Network. Welcome, Dr. Amanda. Please feel free to start your talk. I think your network
Okay.
is fixed now.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if they were yours or mine. Nobody was responding to me in the chat. Can I ask, I'm looking to share my slides. I was expecting them to be here. Are my slides available? Do you want me to share them?
Yeah. You need support to share your slides?
I thought they were going to be on the session. Do you want me to share them? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We will send you instructions on how to send your slides.
Okay. Let me just share screen. So I apologize while we're sorting this out that you're seeing my slightly chaotic whole screen here for me to get to my slides. Can you see that? So could somebody let me know if you can see the screen?
Yeah, Dr. Amanda, please try to share your slides.
I have. I think I have. So I think I've shared the screen. Can you see it?
Yeah, it starts showing. Yeah, it's okay now.
It's starting to show. Okay, let me just do this. I'm using PowerPoint to make it work for you. There we go. So just, I can't see you while I'm looking at these. So if you can just tell me one last time that you can see these clearly, then I'll get started. So just confirm that you can see that screen clearly. Hello? Would somebody please confirm if you can see the screen, or let me know you can?
We are now viewing your slides, so you can.
Brilliant, wonderful. That's a great start. So I'll start. Thank you very much. Very flattering as it is, I'm not actually a doctor. I'm Amanda Brock, and I'm CEO at OpenUK. And I want to start by apologising for my Wi-Fi issues. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but I'm in Edinburgh, Scotland today, and I'm at a place called Oh, the Earth Discovery Centre, which is a green venue and a very sustainable building. And I was using their Wi-Fi, but we're now tethered to my phone. So I hope this is going to work. We're also starting a little bit earlier than I expected. So I hope that you'll forgive me for the slight technical issues. It's a great pleasure to speak with you today and have the opportunity to talk to you about open source software. And I appreciate that we are connected up with 2 different locations, and it's great to see people in Africa and the Middle East. I have not done a lot of work in either of those places, a little bit, but not a lot. So it's interesting to see you all. I think it's worth starting by giving you a little bit of context about my background. So I was a lawyer for 25 years. I worked as a lawyer until 2017. And I got involved in a company called Canonical in 2008. And Canonical is one of the, I guess probably today not the biggest, but it was the UK's biggest and one of the world's best known open source companies back in 2008. And I use that term open source company sort of loosely because I'll talk later about what it means to have open source in business. But Canonical was the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system, and Ubuntu was the operating system of choice for developers. It was also used across the desktop and very focused on creating a user interface which worked for consumers. And I think it was very groundbreaking in the work that it did, making open source more consumer friendly at that time. And I worked there for 5 years. I set up the legal team and ran it and worked globally doing that. And as well as that legal work, that legal background, and my journey to becoming the CEO of OpenUK today, I do a number of other roles. And I have, for a couple of years, chaired a UN Technology Innovation Labs advisory board on open source and IP. And this year I was elected to the Open Source Initiative. And if anybody doesn't know the Open Source Initiative, it is the guardian or the home of the open source definition. And it is the organization that approves open source licenses. I do a lot of writing as well as sitting on a number of advisory boards. And I have a book which is going to be published in September, Open Source Law, Policy and Practice. And I'm the editor. There are 24 chapters. We're just at the final copy edit stages. And the other authors are 20 world leading authorities on open source, all different aspects of it. So you'll see that the great and the good of open source in that book. I think the most exciting thing about it is that the book will not only be available for sale from Oxford University Press, it will also be open access, and it will be freely available as an e-reader and as a PDF. So I hope that that will make it more available to people. And of course, the other thing that I do is a lot of this kind of stuff. And prior to the pandemic, I traveled the world giving talks like this. I'm in Edinburgh today because I was giving another talk here today, and I'm going to Glasgow tomorrow. But also, I still do a number of these digital talks. And I think it's nice that you're back in the room together. It makes a huge difference. I'm very sorry I'm not with you today. So, how is open source doing in the 2020s? Well, I don't know about you, but the 2020s have been a bit of a shock for me so far. And they started in a hugely celebratory mode. And I know how the 2020s should be defined, but bear with me. Let's just go for 2020 being the start of it. It makes it easier for a talk. So we were ringing in the roaring 20s at the end of 2019, and we saw the world shifting. If you were in technology, it was a hugely exciting time because we saw the mainstream digitalization of technology. Europe was talking about its digital decade, and we saw this really beginning to take shape. And that's a very interesting thing because 20 years ago, I worked on a digital transformation in a retail company in the UK. I just finished working with an internet service providers in the dot-com boom. And I was working in a retail environment where we were looking at building the digital business of the future. And it didn't work for all sorts of different reasons, one of which was connectivity. 20 years later, looking around me, looking at the world we're living in today, we see businesses, at least in Europe and the US, across the board have digitalized. We see this not just in technology companies, but we see it everywhere. We see it in our public sector. And that really impacts and influences what we do. So I was very excited at the beginning of 2020 that Europe was moving into its digital decade. And this is Ursula von der Leyen, who many of you will recognize. She's the president of the European Commission, and she appointed a woman called Margrethe Vestager as the VP of Digital and also the Competition Commissioner. Now, Margrethe Vestager knows more about technology than almost any government official in the world, in my opinion. She's been in this role as the Competition Commissioner for around a decade, and the research and work she's done on antitrust and competition has allowed her to really dig deep into where the revenue comes from and how it's generated and distributed across technology. And in this letter at the end of 2019, Ursula von der Leyen had written, "Changes in digital technologies and geopolitics are already having a profound effect on the lives of Europeans. We are witnessing major shifts all the way from global power structures to local politics. What we do now will determine what kind of world our children live in and will define Europe's place in the world, creating a Europe fit for the digital age." Now, I don't really read from slides. I'm not very good at it. I just usually talk to pictures. But I wanted to read that. It's important to me. And it's important because if you swap European for your country, so if I swap it for UK, and we start to talk about a UK for the digital age, or a United Arab Emirates, or any African country you like fit for the digital age, or we could say the continent fit for the digital age. This applies to all of us, and it is at the very heart and essence of everything that is happening in digital technology. And what's particularly interesting to me in this comment is not just the ubiquity or universality of her remark, but the reference to geopolitics and the shift and change it's having. And that shift and change in geopolitics is having an impact on technology and ultimately on open source that I'm going to talk to you about today. So this is me at my last conference with some of my colleagues, and it's my last conference face-to-face before the pandemic started. If any of you are particularly interested in open source software, the conference we were at is Fosdem, Free and Open Source Developers Europe Meetup. It's a free conference. It's always on the 1st February Sunday of the year, so the first Sunday in February. And it has about 18,000 developers turn up in Brussels. And it was a huge face-to-face event. Everything else for me after that, for the rest of 2020 and 21, became digital. But it's particularly important, this photo, and you'll see that I'm with 3 colleagues from OpenUK standing outside the European Commission. And we're standing outside the European Commission at 11:59 p.m. on the 31st of January. And in a minute's time, the UK Brexits. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with Brexit, the UK's exit from the European Union. It would have been hard to notice it. And whether you're for or against it, we now live in a world in the UK where we have to get on with it because that's what's happened. But at this moment in time, standing outside the Commission, it was very emotional. And at midnight, the lights went down. I don't know if the Commission put their lights off every night, but that night at midnight when the UK left, they turned the lights off and we were standing in the dark. And it was a worrying experience. The reason I'm dwelling on it, talking to you today, is I doubt that there are very many other geopolitical shifts that one can define so clearly. And what we see is an exact moment when a geopolitical shift had an impact. And it had an impact across the board on the UK and on Europe. But it's not the only geopolitical shift that we're seeing. And I'll talk to you more about those as we start to talk more about technology. Now, as I'm in Scotland, I thought I would share you this picture, which is actually the Scottish variant of COVID. I don't know if any of you have seen it before, but this particular variant, you can hear it coming, which is always quite helpful. Joking aside, the next thing that happened in the 20s, beyond Brexit and the start of geopolitical shift in my mind, was COVID. And of course, none of us had planned for a pandemic and none of us knew what was really hitting us. But that also had an impact on digital technologies, and we started to see more and more digitalization. But at the same time, we saw more and more geopolitical shift in Europe. And what we saw happening was a concerted activity across the EU focused on both the big tech companies and some of the countries they're from. And the Schrems judgment, which set aside something called the Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield was the way that we shared data from the EU into the US. It was a standard way of doing it, which negated the need for an audit. So we saw Schrems 2, and we saw a number of associated projects, including the setup of Gaiax. And Gaiax is a federated data infrastructure for Europe. It's a business-driven organization with business partners and members. And it seeks to create digital sovereignty for Europe through building this federated model data infrastructure, which has about 13 different data spaces or verticals that it's looking for collaborations in across Europe. But this was initially seen at least as being attacking the big tech companies and creating a cloud for Europe. But it wasn't just the US that we saw the EU in conflict with politically. The next was China. And actually, we also saw conflict and geopolitical shift happening between the US and China through the pandemic. And even in the UK, here we saw Huawei's equipment being banned from our 5G networks. But it wasn't just at the government level that we saw this geopolitical shift. We also saw citizen action. And that citizen action started with Black Lives Matter, which reverberated across the globe. And then we saw this citizen action move here to Scotland, to the youth movement, to Glasgow last year and COP26. So shift happening across the board. Almost unbelievably, the next thing that we see here in Europe is a war. And we'll talk again more about the impact of this on open source, which may be an impact that you wouldn't have expected. So how has open source shaped up through this very difficult couple of years that started our roaring 20s? Well, let's start by thinking about what is open source and why does it matter today? So if you were to define open source for a contract or create a policy, you might well say that it's software where the human readable source code is freely available. And you'd probably also add rightly that it should be distributed on an OSI, an open source initiative approved license. And that's not a bad definition of open source, but it's very, very narrow. It's very technical, and it doesn't really express what open source is all about. And if I was to come around the room and ask anybody in the room if you had worked with open source before, for those of you who say yes, I suspect that you will have very different views on what open source is. And your views are likely to come from your experience, pretty much always the way it is. And with open source, that means if you've been contributing as a community member or you've used a community project, you'll think of open source as being community driven. If you've been involved in one of the big collaborations across governments or across businesses in the last few years, you'll probably think of open source as being something with a lot of corporate or large-scale contributors. And these definitions are all right, but what open source actually is a way that people develop. It's an open source methodology. It's a socio-political movement. But in terms of actually how that happens, it's worth just taking a moment to think about it. And how that happens is that we have collaborative groups or communities contributing. And by contributing, they create maintenance, and they can look at things like security to ensure that the open source that they're creating has longevity, that it's going to be around for a while, that it's going to be well maintained, that there's a community who want to contribute to it, to make sure it's secure, to make sure it has documents. So simply having that short definition of open source doesn't really work. And open source creates huge value, but we have to think about how we measure it. And often when you stick with a very narrow definition, that definition I've given you of open source being human readable code, which is shared publicly on an OSI approved license, what you do is you seek to use open source as a sort of tick box or bureaucratic exercise. But if you think behind why you're doing it, often you are doing it for economic reasons, and those economic reasons are probably to avoid lock-in or to create code that can be recycled and reused. And if you simply stick with the basic I've described of the code being shared publicly and on an open source license, the chances of you achieving those economic goals of avoiding lock-in or creating code that can be recycled and reused are slim. And what we have to do is think to a broader policy and broader processes to ensure that we build open source that isn't just going to create a wasteland of unusable code. So we've seen a shift in adoption of open source. Back in 2008, when I joined Canonical, we spent a lot of time persuading people that they ought to use it. Today, there is no doubt that you are using it. If you look at the various statistics that come from surveys and reports, you'll see between 58 and 98% of code bases being made up of open source. Now, that will partly depend on what you're measuring, how it's defined, and also the sectors and things you're looking at. But what is absolutely clear is that the majority of code bases today are open source. So how do we shift from this situation in 2008 where we're trying to persuade people to use open source to a situation today where it's clearly the majority of code? And I think there have been three reasons for that in the last 10, 12 years. The first is digitalization. Now, whilst Europe may be celebrating its digital decade, I think that's very much for the mainstream. If we look at technology, the last decade was very much technology companies. The last decade was very much a digital decade. And what we've seen is the rise of the developer. So the role that is played by engineers and developers in businesses across all businesses has elevated. And the developer now is able to have much more power in the decision-making process. But the second thing has been Git. And the creation of Git has allowed repositories like GitHub and GitLab to come to prevalence. And that allows for open source projects and organizations to distribute their code on these repositories, which the developer can go directly and take. Now, when I was trying to persuade people to use open source, I was talking to lawyers, I was talking to procurement teams, I was talking about risk with them. Those conversations don't happen today. What happens is that the code is in the businesses, and it means is that it's absolutely procedures in your organization for developers so that they're using code that you're happy with in the way that you're happy with. So for me, the rise of the developer and the access to code which can be freely taken from a GitHub or equivalent repository by developers without having to go through legal and procurement are two of the key changes in the rise to open source. And the third is the cloud. This slide was created by a gentleman called Dan Cohen, who's sadly no longer with us. But Dan was the executive director at Cloud Native, and he pulled together this map. Now, if you look for the current one, you'll see it has hundreds of projects involved in it. And you'll see that you have a funding in the billions and a market cap in the trillions around Cloud Native. And around cloud, what you see is that the public cloud is generally built on open source. Now, of course, I would tell you there's been a rise in open source. Of course, I would tell you it's the norm. Of course, I would tell you it's the way that you should be looking at development. And I assume you all know who that is. It's Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux and Git. So this is my fangirl picture, and that's in 2019. I used to get them taken each year because he'd be at Open Source Summit. And of course, I've not had one done in 2 years, but I'm hopeful to get a new one later this year. So as I say, don't listen to people like Linus and I who, we advocate for open source. Listen to Microsoft. When I joined Canonical in 2008, Microsoft was bug zero. The destruction of Microsoft was on our targets. It was our first item on our agenda back then, because Microsoft was public enemy number one if you were an open source. Microsoft's CEO, Steve Ballmer, had described open source as a cancer. And you've probably seen there was litigation and there was competition and antitrust debates around Microsoft and open source. But by 2018, my friend Steve Wally, who was also in Edinburgh when he was doing this talk, was speaking at the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit. And Steve explained that he was representing Microsoft because Satya Nadella wanted to be judged on Microsoft's recent and future actions. And he explained that that was because open source was key to their strategy. And if you look at Microsoft, they're probably the single biggest contributor to open source software by lines of code today. And Steve gave 3 reasons for that. The first reason he gave was that customers today ask for open source software because some of the most innovative and creative tools and development has been done in open source. The second reason he gave is that there are a generation of young software developers who have grown up understanding only this. They've only ever used open source. They've only ever worked in an open source way. I don't mean that they never see proprietary code, but they only understand the way that they work is to recycle and reuse. The way that they work is on an open source methodology. And then the third reason he gave is what I've just been explaining to you, the cloud. He references Microsoft's Azure business and said it wouldn't be possible without open source. And what that means is not just that you have to have open source to use it, but that as you develop as a business with open source, you also want to contribute back. And you don't do that entirely altruistically. You do it because it allows you to influence the code, to influence feature development. So Steve was very clear on why Microsoft has been on that shift. But through the 2020s, we've had many things that I've explained to you already, or you already know, to be honest, but I've shared with you some of the many things we've had to deal with. And of course, the COVID pandemic is one of those. And I wouldn't necessarily hold out the Test and Trace app here in the UK as the best example, but we've also seen some great open source apps coming out of Germany and other parts of the world. The Linux Foundation have set up Linux Foundation Public Health as a home for some of those apps and tools, including passports. And what we saw here was the need and the inevitability of a global response that was open. I think it's disappointing it wasn't more coordinated and that we had so many different apps, but we have seen that some of the apps have had mass adoption now. And certainly it was very clear to all governments that they needed to take an open source approach to it. And the technology tool that focuses on helping to support that evolution has to be open source. Now, we've had some real challenges to face in open source. It's mining. And strip mining is a very American term. It's from the 1970s from New York State, and it's a reference to coal mining where too much was taken off the land and the land was destroyed because of it, so overuse. And this New York Times article in 2019, I think it was December 2019, really appealed to me because I was excited to see open source in the New York Times. And they weren't just talking about open source, but it was the primary focus. And what they were talking about here is how Amazon and some of the other cloud companies use open source software and don't give back enough money. Now, when I left Canonical, I spent a couple of years in a law firm advising startups who wanted to open source, sense that people can. I had the same conversation many times with young entrepreneurs or engineers who wanted to be entrepreneurs. And I came up with this little theory for them, which I call what if. What if you develop some software and somebody else uses it? And generally at that point, they're nodding and smiling, and that they understand that that's what open source is about. That's what open source is. Then my second what if is what if somebody else takes your code? Confusion, some of them look less commercial type licensing, which is suitable for non-code, and source definition to exclude anybody else from using your code. So once you release code open source, If it is on an OSI approved license, that will meet the open source definition. And the open source definition says that you cannot discriminate against people and you cannot discriminate against fields of endeavor. So once you've released that code, you cannot take it back and you cannot stop someone else using it and making money. So my second what if someone else takes your code and makes money? Not always great for some of them. The third what if someone else takes your code and they make a lot of money? And even worse, you don't. Now at that point, I lost quite a lot of them. And this is exactly what happened here. So Amazon and some of the cloud companies were accused of strip mining open source companies, particularly in the database space, but in a slightly more broad space. And they were accused of this by 7 open source companies, including Elastic. And Elastic had a product called OpenSearch, which they said Amazon was abusing. Now, I should be clear here that what Amazon and the cloud companies were doing is absolutely fine in terms of open source licensing. Whatever your moral or ethical views on it, slightly different. There is nothing about morals or ethics within open source licensing. It's a way to distribute software, and it's a way of distributing software where the code is shared openly and the license meets the 10 definitions. So from a technical perspective, and I've talked to you about this already, what Amazon are doing, what the cloud companies are doing is absolutely fine. Sadly, what's not fine is creating FUD. And FUD is a term that open source people started to use a decade ago. And they use fear, uncertainty, and doubt when they're talking about misinformation around open source. And the open source communities have had a lot of dealings with this from 10 years ago when there were the battles over the desktop through to the cloud companies. And back in 2008, there was a chap called Matt Aslett who wrote the first report I've seen on commercialization of open source. And one of the things he called out there was that open source is not a business model. Now, anybody who works in open source who understands it will agree with that. Open source is a product if you're looking at it from a business perspective, and you have to work out how you are going to generate money on a product you give away. And that kind of economic or revenue generation consideration isn't something that's entirely new. There's a lot of that going on just now. We're seeing a lot of shift in TV and film, in music, where we're having to work out new ways of creating revenue by providing services around something that's given away. And if you run a business around open source, calling it an open source business can be confusing. It's something that I and everybody do. But it is a little bit confusing because the business is one that distributes open source. It's one who has a product that's open source that it commercializes. And as I said, FUD is not okay. And what Elastic did here in response to Amazon, now bear in mind that Elastic were making a lot of money too. They just wanted to make more, and they felt that Amazon wasn't sharing enough of their product revenue. So what Elastic did was post this blog post saying that they were doubling down on open. And that would give you the impression, quite rightly, that they were making something more open source. In fact, what they were doing was moving away from open source. And they moved from being on an open source license approved by the OSI to something called the SSPL. And the SSPL is a license drafted by a lawyer called Heather Meeker. And Heather had drafted this for MongoDB, another company who is unhappy with the cloud provider strip mining, as a response to try to restrict that. And whilst this says that it's simplified and more permissive, it is not open source. And it is not open source because it went into the OSI approval process, and there were a lot of concerns about it, so it was withdrawn. It wasn't rejected, it was withdrawn. So this headline, Doubling Down on Open, Part 2, is actually quite disingenuous, to use a lawyer's word. It's misleading. It's FUD. Nobody here is doubling down on open. Actually, what they're doing is moving away from it. And that space with the companies who have open sourced their code and not thought about what if up front, that space isn't the only one we've seen this challenge in. Over the last couple of years, we've seen adoption in telco and chip companies become very high. And those same companies are very involved in standards. The telco sector is one of the most standards driven in the world. It's also quite an immature business, quite an immature sector. So telco really only took off in the 1990s. And what the mobile network operators have had to go through is that they have built business models which have very quickly been undermined and challenged and disrupted. So what we've seen is a lot of change in those. And what we're seeing now is that the telcos are concerned because they have revenue from standard essential patents. As I said, they're a very standards-driven sector, and their standards use a lot of patents that they have a FRAND licensing on, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. And the problem with that is that it doesn't sit with open source. So what we're seeing now is an attack through the standards bodies on open source, where they would like to change it so that it's open source apart from their patent licenses. And unfortunately, there are issues around adding extra licenses, particularly to some of the existing open source licenses like the GPL. So again, we're seeing this challenge on open source and what it means, what its definition is, that's come about not from within our sector, but from mass adoption and people wanting to take advantage of its free nature, but not willing to give back. And we've also seen a number of challenges around security. May last year, we saw President Biden issue an ordinance which focuses on the supply chain. Maybe a bit of a premonition there, because later in the year we saw a massive problem with Log4j. And Log4j isn't one of the top 100 open source projects in terms of usage or contribution, but it is ubiquitous. It is a small thing that's used everywhere and caused lots of problems. And actually where we saw most problems were in the places where it was used in a closed way and it had been incorporated into something closed and it wasn't obvious and open that it was being used. And what that did was really focus us on security. And we're seeing a response to this security question by firstly recognizing that open source is not the problem, software is the problem, and that we need to find funding. And that funding goes beyond the critical systems. And the response that's come from our open source industry collaboration and from the open source sector has largely to date come through the Open Source Software Security Foundation, OpenSSF, who have been dealing directly with the White House. They've recently announced a 300 million investment, a collaborative investment into securing open source. And it matters because what we're seeing is a shift in our infrastructure. I started by talking about digitalization. And what we're seeing here in the UK is our energy digitalization task force suggesting that a spine, an infrastructure is built, a digital infrastructure that is open source. And that makes us think, and it makes us think about how are we going to create open source that is stewarded or has a custodian, that is secure, that has documentation, that is well maintained, that has a funded community. And my view on that is we now need to start to look globally. And it's why it's so important to be speaking to all of you today. We need to work globally to join this up and to collaborate. But we've also seen that collaboration here in Scotland last year, and OpenUK, my company, my organisation, hosted an Open Technology for Sustainability Day, where we elevated the role of open source. And we see that role playing out in Africa with projects like Mojaloop. They spin out from the Gates Foundation, which is a payment platform. And we see an increase in Africa in the festival that was held this year in Lagos and other open source events. And open source really is about that global and international collaboration. And what we can't do is we can't restrict anybody, as I've said when we were talking about commercialization. But the same has been true when we look at the war in Ukraine. In March, there was a terrible, heartbreaking conversation with a number of the developers in Ukraine on Twitter hosting a call, and 8 of them talked about their experiences of the war. Some of them had put down their keyboards and taken up arms. And at OpenUK, we tried to support that with fundraising. But what we found was that some of the developers took a different approach, and they created something called, oh, the word's gone out of my head. It'll come back to me in a second. It begins with P and it ends with where? 2 seconds and it will come back to me. Protestware, sorry. So they created protestware, and what protestware was doing was hacking into systems in Russia to make the code not work. And one of the hardest things I think I've had to do in recent years was when a friend from open source in Ukraine approached me to be part of this. Not to be part of hacking, but to be part of something that stopped open source code going to Russia. And I had to say no to him, because open source is for everybody, and open source is something that is global. So I've left talking about OpenUK to the end because I wanted to see what time I had. And I'm going to take a few minutes to go through this. I don't know whether there'll be time for questions. But in response to everything that's been going on in the last couple of years and these changes and the impacts that it's had on open source, I took on the leadership of OpenUK 2.5 years ago. And we are an organization which is about UK leadership. We are focused on the geographical UK, but we are also about global collaboration. And we are currently talking to a number of people about becoming international ambassadors for us, with the potential for some of them to look to set up organizations in their home countries. And there's definite interest in Botswana and Kenya. But if anybody else in watching today is interested in the work that we do and interested in building a similar organization in their home country, just let me know. And we're built largely on a volunteer basis. We have 2 paid members of staff, and we have a very broad range of people who are in leadership roles. And then we have a large number of ambassadors. I will say it has been very easy for me to build such a big group because the UK is in a position where it has a vast number of developers. I think the European Commission's estimate on us Brexiting was that 230,000 open source developers were based in the UK. And particularly in the Kubernetes space, we not only see scale of numbers, but we see scale of leadership. And our organization works in 3 ways. We have 3 pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning. And with community, we have an opportunity to bring together that leadership and that scale of people. And we do it through celebrating their achievements and activities. And this is our awards ceremony last year. And we use that voice that's created by bringing together a large and cohesive community. And we use that voice to influence laws and influence policy. So we have quite a number of lawyers in the organization, and we respond to legislation in the UK, in Europe. We've been involved in a couple of pieces in the US and the litigation in the US. On the policy side, I mentioned Gaiax, the EU federated data structure, which we have been a member of since day one. And then we started to be recognized for that, and Europe very quickly recognized OpenUK as the actor. I mentioned that we responded to the US, but in the policy side, we also started last year to bring together reports. And for our State of Open last year, we did it in 3 phases. This year, we're planning on doing it in 1 phase, although there's so much good stuff, it could end up being 2. We've recently put out a survey, and that survey is running until the 12th of June. And our report will be issued in July with the output of the survey, with case studies, and with thought leadership. And you can see from the information we got last year in the survey, here's 9 key stats from it. And these sums are large amounts of money. And what we see economically is that open source software alone, not even hardware and data, but open source software alone is contributing 20% of the digital economy, using what I consider to be quite outdated methodologies of calculating what that is. And those tend to be around total cost of ownership, lines of code in, numbers of developers. I would like to see us move more to a values-based or value-based economic calculation. And this is our survey that's ongoing at the moment. We also look beyond economics, and I think this is really important. So when we were at COP26 last year, it became very clear to me that the Sustainable Development Goals align very much with the principles of open technology. And I don't think I explained this to you at the start. OpenUK is an unusual organization. We were the first in the world to shift, and we shifted away from open source software to open technology, which we define as open source software, open hardware, and open data. I've really focused on software today because that's what I was asked to talk about. but we also advocate for open data and open hardware. Now, when we look at those against the Sustainable Development Goals, what we saw and what we created last year for COP26 was a blueprint, and we created a blueprint for the data center of the future built on open technology, which from a purely environmental perspective can potentially reduce emissions by about 70%. And of course, the more we digitalize, the more data processing happens, and the more data centers are becoming an ugly secret that we don't really want to talk about. So we took that on head on. This year, we're working on a similar project with electric vehicle charging, and we hope to create a second blueprint and to prove the model. And then if the model can be proven, what we hope to do is to create that template and share it so others can build blueprints too. This year, we're doing a 1 year on event for COP26, so a second Open Technology for Sustainability Day, which will take place this autumn. As opposed to doing COP27, we're going to stick with what we were talking about at COP26 and look at how we are doing 1 year on. What are we able to deliver? And as well as delivering our blueprint, we're hoping to deliver societal value metrics. And those societal value metrics are going to be a way that we can look at technology and we can look at the values, plural, not the economic value, but the values that it generates across society. And the third of our pillars, community, legal and policy, and learning. And we've given away about 8,000 digital glove kits to children across the UK to take part in 2 courses, 2 summer camps, which we've actually won an award for. And we are now starting to focus both on younger and older people. We are looking at building a project that will be quite musical for 2023 for primary school children, so children aged 11 and under. And we're also looking at building a MOOC, a massive open online course, which we would make available freely for students to take part in. And that's likely also to be leveraged and modified to participate in a practical apprenticeship scheme. And this is an example of our kids course. If you're interested, the URL is there. There's 2 courses. The second one, or 2 camps, I should say, and each camp is 10 lessons plus 10 magazines, digital magazines called e-zines. So each is 10 to 20 minutes long. The glove that you need to do the course can be made. It's an open source glove, but you need to get a BBC microbit to do it. And the course is freely available, Creative Commons, so please feel free to take it, to use it, to recycle it. And that's part of the whole alignment with sustainability. But what we also see is that the course here teaches sustainability. So we actually talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and what those are through the second course, the second camp. And as I say, we were an award-winning project. And this is just a couple of snippets that may or may not be of interest to show you the kind of traction that we've been able to create in just over 2 years as a tiny organization. And I've mentioned that we're looking for ambassadors, we're looking for people interested in building similar organizations in other countries. And if we can do that as a geographic focused, internationally collaborating, admittedly, organization, and with everything that I've shared with you, I'm sure you can see what you can do in your own countries and what we can do collaboratively globally. And that collaboration, despite everything that's going on in the world, is what's going to make 2022 the year of the open source tiger. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amanda, for sharing with us this nice presentation about open source. We here at SEC also, we support a national strategy for open source called FOSS, Free and Open Source Software. If anyone interested.